Good afternoon and happy 4th of July. Welcome to our first SRG Live event. We are honored to be joined today by Colonel Philip Smith. If you're watching live on Zoom, you will have the ability to ask Colonel Smith questions during the presentation. Please click the Q&A button on your screen and type in your question and press submit. At the end of his presentation, we will ask and answer as many questions as time allows. Philip Smith spent 33 years in the United States Air Force. They were years filled with the joys of flying and with the horrors of isolation and captivity. Through it all, he maintained his sense of self and dignity. He and his wife now live at Maravilla Scottsdale. Phil is here today to talk briefly about his military career and how he overcame adversity in life. It is my pleasure to introduce Colonel Philip E. Smith.
Thank you, Alyssa. I'm honored to be here today as we celebrate the birth of the United States of America. Happy birthday, America, and happy 4th of July to all of you. Many years ago, a young boy stood on a farm in Illinois, listening to the sounds of airplanes flying overhead. It was 1942, and the U.S. bombers flying out of Omaha, Nebraska, were preparing to go to war in Europe. I was that young boy, and I was playing one of my favorite games. I would stand there for hours holding a small aircraft recognition book that showed pictures of airplanes from different angles. On a clear day, when I could see the airplanes, I would look at the wings, the tails, count the engines, and try to identify the aircraft from my book. They were all propeller planes and not flying very high, so it was a fine sport. Seeing and hearing those airplanes gave me chills. I was a farm boy with chores that never ended. My life was rooted in the rich Illinois farmland and controlled by a very hardworking, demanding father. As often as possible, however, my eyes and ears were on the sky. Even on a cloudy day when I could not see the airplanes, I listened for them, and I tried to determine whether I was hearing a B-17 or a B-24. And one day I heard a sound I'd never heard before and would never forget. And then I saw the airplane. It was a B-29, the biggest bomber flown in World War II. To my young ears, the sound of its four engines was awesome, much like a deep, dramatic gunshot, gun-wrenching growl. Being able to fly an airplane like that was beyond my comprehension. A childhood dream, perhaps, but certainly no more than that. I was one of 6 children. My siblings were smart, they got A's in school, and the teachers liked them. I preferred to play games and sports and chase girls and tinker with farm machinery with my dad. Our dad was hard on all of us. He couldn't stop working and expected us to work too. And work we did, although not always willingly. We knew, however, that at the core of our family was a strength, a bond, a belief in one another that was as strong and abiding as the land we farmed. I have never doubted that that environment had a profound effect on the development of my character and my personality. I graduated from high school in Root House and then enrolled in the Institute of Aviation at the University of Illinois. That was a 2-year course that prepared students to obtain an FAA aircraft and engine mechanics license and a private pilot's license. But after graduating from that program, I decided I would rather fly airplanes than work on them. So I joined the Air Force and went through pilot training. During my 33 years of active duty with the Air Force, I flew the F-86, the F-100, and the F-4. But my favorite one of all was a single-engine, single-seat F-104 Starfighter. At one point, the 104 held 3 world records simultaneously for top speed, highest altitude, and greatest rate of climb. It set the world altitude record of 103,395 feet back in the 1950s. I flew one up to 94,000 feet, where you can actually see the curvature of the Earth. I was flying an F-104 on that fateful day in September in 1965. My squadron from George Air Force Base in California had been sent to Da Nang in South Vietnam a few months earlier. Fear was growing around the world that communism was spreading from North Vietnam to South Vietnam and other countries in Southeast Asia. We were sent on air defense missions out of Da Nang that would be long and tedious. 4 pilots flew 4 hours or longer, refueling from a tanker in the air. The main point of the mission was to identify enemy aircraft and keep them away from U.S. ships in the Tonkin Gulf. On this day, 4 pilots took off. I was suited up in case there was a problem in the air, and there was. One of the fighters was unable to take on fuel from the airborne tanker called a KC-135 by the Air Force, but was actually a modified Boeing 707. That fighter had to abort the mission. I was sent in his place. I launched to rendezvous with the other 3 airplanes. After takeoff, I found the airborne tanker, topped off my fuel tanks, and then contacted Panama, the radar controller who would provide bearing and distance information that I would need to rendezvous with my flight. I received assuring updates. Maintain your heading. Your flight is now 80 miles away. Your flight is now dead ahead for 50, then 20. But ultimately, the tone changed. The transmissions became alarming. Now we have you, now we don't. Squawk this, squawk that. Turn left, turn right. And then finally, we do not have you on our scope. During all the turns, my heading indicator had stopped working. They didn't know where I was, and neither did I. No radar contact, no heading indicator, and a solid layer of clouds below. The only thing I knew for sure was I must be near Hainan. As I looked down, a hole in the clouds revealed a coastline. I needed to identify that coastline and head west. I dropped out of the clouds and leveled off for about 10,000 feet. Seconds later, I felt heavy thumps on my airplane as if someone was banging on it with a sledgehammer. I looked down. There were no ships shooting at me. And then I saw an aircraft breaking off his firing path. I didn't know where he came from or how he got behind me, but there it was, a MiG-19 with the Red Star of China on his tail. I turned toward the MiG. This was my chance. I would get behind it and shoot it down. I pulled to the right, and then the stick went dead. Both hydraulic gauges were at 0. The aircraft was not responding, and the nose was going down. The water was coming up fast. I made one last radio transmission to Panama, giving my call sign and saying, "I've been hit, I'm ejecting now." I pulled the ejection handle, and from there, everything happened automatically. The canopy blew off, the rocket motor attached to the seat forced the seat up and out of the airplane. There I was, tumbling through the air, still attached to my seat. Seconds later, the lap belt released and the seat separator activated, and I was hurled from the seat like a slingshot, tumbling through space, now a free-falling body. And then I felt a hard jolt, and the parachute deployed automatically. And suddenly the world was no longer spinning, tumbling, reeling. I was floating down like a feather. There was a deadly silence to it, and I could hear the flutter of the parachute and the wind whistling through the risers. I knew I had almost no chance of being rescued. I was too far away from the coast of either North or South Vietnam, where there might be helicopters in the area to pick me up. We'd been taught in survival school that if we ever had to parachute into hostile territory, to take advantage of our altitude and look around for a possible escape and evasion plan. I looked toward the coast in the distance and noted a wooden area off to the left. If I could reach that thicket, perhaps I could hide there for a few days and use my radio to make contact with search and rescue teams. The plan might have worked if it had not been for two rather sobering obstacles. I was coming down over water near the coast and it was highly visible. And once I stopped looking at the land beyond the coast, I looked down at the water below me and I couldn't believe my eyes. I was coming down in the middle of a Chinese fishing fleet. Once I hit the water, I was pulled into one boat and then gradually moved up the chain of command into bigger boats and finally taken to shore under gunpoint and put on a truck. I was, they informed me, on China's Hainan Island. Later that night, I was flown in an old DC-3 to the city of Canton on mainland China near Hong Kong. Initially, the Chinese didn't seem to know what to do with me. The US and China were not at war, and both sides were trying to avoid direct conflict. As a result, I was treated reasonably well at first and even hoped I might be released. I was held in a military complex in Canton in southern China. Within hours of my shoot down, the Chinese announced to the world that one of their airplanes had shot down a US F-104 near Hainan Island and captured its pilot, Captain Philip E. Smith. I was the first American to be captured by the Chinese since the Korean War, and at least their announcement revealed to my family and everyone else that I was alive. I was held in Canton 4 long, uncertain, unsettling months, being interrogated over and over. At times, the interrogators seemed almost pleasant, but gradually I could see a change in them. I could see pity in their eyes, and nothing frightened me more than that. They knew their communist government had come to a decision, and that would be a devastating blow to me. And a blow it was. I was going to be moved not south toward Hong Kong, which might mean release, but north to Peking, now Beijing, far north in China. In January 1966, I was put on a train under heavy guard for a 2-day trip to Beijing. It was the bleakest trip imaginable, for I knew I was going the wrong direction. The prison in Beijing was large, I saw, as I was led into it. It was not a military complex. I learned later it was filled not with foreigners, but with Chinese prisoners, common criminals, as well as those rounded up during the dark days of the Red Guards, when gangs of thugs ran rampant over the human rights of so many of the Chinese. I can assure you that life in that northern capital city was grim indeed. For an American prisoner in China, the feelings of coldness and desolation go far beyond the weather. There were mornings when I got up in my cell and found that the water in my small wash basin had frozen overnight. But the truly horrifying coldness came not from the weather, but from the conditions of the prison, from the people who worked there, and from the dreadful realization that man's inhumanity to man sometimes knows no bounds. I knew I had entered the pits of the Chinese prison system. Being captured does something to you physically, and perhaps even more importantly, it does something to you mentally. It tears you apart in every way. Little did I know, and it's a good thing I didn't know, that I would be held captive for 7.5 years. The first year of captivity was the hardest. I was torn apart by feelings of fear, anxiety, anger, and sheer loneliness and despair. My cell measured 10 by 12 feet with a table, a chair, a wash basin, a bed of boards with a thin pad, and a 5-gallon bucket in the corner to be used as a latrine. During my entire captivity, I did not have a cellmate. From the beginning, the Chinese communists declared that I was not a POW, but an international criminal. And the Geneva Convention, as it related to treatment and handling of POWs, did not apply in my case. I would remain a prisoner, I was told, until I met their demands and accepted their communist ideology. My case, they said, would be handled according to Chinese law and no one else's. Year after year, they tried to break me and wear me down mentally and physically. They wanted to turn me into a traitor to my country by trying to force me to make anti-war, anti-US statements and to denounce everything I believed in. They did not succeed. As the time in prison passed, I realized something of great importance, how remarkably resilient we are when we have to be. I was locked away from blue sky and green grass, and from flowers and trees, and the world as we know it. But in a sense, I did have all that. For what a glorious thing is the human mind. Time after time, my mind took me out of that cell to wherever I wanted to go. I saw the beauties of nature. I went on picnics. I built houses in great detail, led wagon trains, and tried to remember every one of my teachers and classmates at school. I relived my life, talked to my family and friends. My mind games helped keep me alive. There were bad moments, but I quickly learned that wallowing in self-pity accomplished nothing. Paying attention to what was going on around me might. I started to listen to the sounds outside my cell. I became an animal in the wild, watching and sniffing for danger. And one morning, the guard opened my door to allow me to empty my bucket in the latrine at the end of the hall. The latrine itself was revolting, but while I was there, I noticed something that would ultimately play a major role in the lives of those held in the cell block. It was a mop. In sign language, I asked the guard if I could use the mop to clean my floor cell, and he nodded yes. In the days and weeks after that, as my ears began to pick up more sounds of the cell block, I could hear the swish, swish of that mop as it was used in surrounding cells and along the length of the hall. And one day I heard something that brought unexpected tears to my eyes. I'd been listening to the morning activity of the cell block when suddenly someone mopping the hall right outside my cell began to whistle very softly. It was only a few bars, but he was whistling the theme song of the United States Air Force. I couldn't believe my ears. Someone was telling me that he knew I was there and that someone had to be an American. For so long, I had felt totally alone. I could only thank God that the wall of silence around me had been broken, if only for that moment. I found out who it was one day when I was taken to another cell to listen to Radio Peking. And there were two Americans. They were John Downey and Richard Fecteau. The two men had been recruited during college by the CIA. Soon after their college graduation, they were flying a spy mission over China. They were trying to recover the CIA agent on the ground who had been dropped behind hostile lines. During the recovery attempt, Downey and Fecteau's plane had been shot down by the Chinese and they were captured. They had been put on trial and sentenced to long prison terms. When I first met them, they had been in prison for 13 years. I will tell you that I have never and will never meet braver Americans. During their long years of captivity, they never lost hope or faith in themselves or their country. We weren't allowed face-to-face meetings very often, but we did establish a means of communications, and knowing they were there was a huge boost to my morale. They had heard on Radio Peking about an Air Force pilot being shot down. Downey had taken up the mop, correctly assuming I was a pilot. They had been sentenced to long prison terms, but they were both released in the early 1970s. By then, U.S. and China relations had started to improve, in a large part because of the visit to China by President Nixon and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger. Excuse me. Meeting Downey and Fecteau was a rare moment. There weren't many such moments. Sometimes I was allowed to communicate with my family, to receive and write one letter each month, to exercise in a small courtyard, and to have written material, usually communist propaganda written in English. And then everything would be taken away. There would be no heat, no outside exercise, no reading material, nothing at all. Out of it all, I learned some very basic truths during those years. I was placed in solitary confinement with minimum food and deprived of every human dignity. But there are things no captor can take away from you. More powerful than all their threats was the fact that they could not take away my mind or my ideals, nor could they take away my faith in God, my country, my family, the Air Force, or faith in myself. I came out of China at the same time the American POWs were released from North Vietnam in March 1973. And after rigorous physical exams by the Air Force, I received the most welcome news of all, that I had been cleared to return to the cockpit for worldwide duty. To return to the controls of a jet fighter and to resume an active role in my Air Force career played an important part in my post-war adjustment and helped to restore the confidence that I needed. After retirement from the Air Force, I was invited by the Chinese authorities to return to China as their guest. I wondered about the wisdom of such a return visit, but I wanted to go back and revisit my battlefield under different circumstances and to try to put those years of captivity into some kind of perspective. I went back to the old prison, walked into the very cell where I'd been held all those years, and saw one of the old prison guards who was working for the security forces, but no longer a guard. 2 days later, I traveled to Shanghai and met the Chinese pilot who shot me down. It was a strange and interesting meeting, one I had requested. We had a long discussion about the events that took place in the skies near Hainan Island on that day in 1965. Perhaps most interesting was what he said to me through an interpreter. I don't know what it's like to get shot down, but I know what it's like to almost shoot myself down. He said he had misjudged its closure rate because my airplane was so small, and he didn't realize how close he was when he opened fire. Pieces of my airplane came back and hit his plane, causing one engine to fail. When he got on the ground, they counted 19 holes in his MiG from fragments of my airplane that he had shot off. And I will add just one final note. Sometime during my years of captivity, I learned that a second American aviator had been shot down and was in our cell block. He was a Navy flyer named Bob Flynn. Bob and I came out of prison together in 1973 and were escorted across a bridge that was the border between China and Hong Kong. We were escorted by a man wearing the uniform of the American Red Cross. When we left the bridge, I saw 3 British Royal Force helicopters parked nearby, their engines running. They were there, our escort told us, to take us to Hong Kong Kai Tak Airport, where we would board a U.S. Air Force hospital plane for a flight to Clark in the Philippines. By the time we reached the choppers, their engines were running and the rotors were whirling. I was the first to reach one of the larger helicopters, and as I came up beside it, one of the crew members inside reached down to take my hand and pull me up. I took that hand, feeling my composure beginning to crumble. For that simple gesture marked the end of a nightmare beyond description. A picture was forever engraved in my mind. 7.5 years before, an old, toothless Chinese fisherman paddled up to me in the Tonkin Gulf, reached out his hand, and pulled me into a small boat. My life, as I knew it, had stopped. Now the journey had come full circle. An RAF two-striper was pulling me back to freedom. With no further delay, I could feel the vibration of the helicopter and the increased speed of the engine as the rotors sprang into action and lifted us off the ground. Hearing and feeling that helicopter take off meant only one thing to me. I was being taken back to freedom. Suddenly, my control was gone. I was overwhelmed, tears streaming down my face. Ultimately, I was able to thank that RAF crew, for they knew they had been part of a special mission, and I felt deeply grateful to them and the Royal Air Force. As I talk to you today, it's clear to all of us that we cannot always control what life dishes out to us, but we can control our response to it. We are living through a dreadful time, but I remember another dreadful time in a prison cell in China, and a fellow American using a mop in the hallway and whistling the theme song of the U.S. Air Force. So simple, so brave, because in the prison hallway, John Downey could have been caught by the prison guards. He risked everything to bring hope and courage to another human being, to me. Today, I wish that hope and courage for all of us. Those of us who were held by enemy forces always knew it was our duty to return with honor. And we also knew that many of our comrades would die trying to do just that. I was one of the lucky ones. I survived and returned home. I'm honored to have had the opportunity to serve our great country under difficult circumstances. And I thank you for being here today. God bless all you. God bless America on this special day in our history. Happy 4th of July. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Philip Smith. We have a few questions from the audience, but before I get into those, if you have a question, please click the Q&A button on your screen and type in your question. Our first question is from Anonymous. What were the thoughts you had in your head when you were being ejected from your plane?
Well, it was a big thrill to get out of the airplane, because if I didn't, I'd crash and die. So it was fun. I was glad to do it.
Okay. How long before you were freed from China before you started flying again?
When I came out of prison, I came back to the U.S. and went to school at the Air War College for a year, and then after that, I went to the jet recurrency school and got recurrent, and so it was about a year and a half after I came out before I started flying again.
From participant Deborah, did you see other fellow POWs after you were released?
Oh yes, we had reunions quite often. The Nixon Library had 2 reunions for us, and of course, President Nixon invited all the POWs to the White House for a dinner, which was the biggest dinner ever held in the White House. When I came to Clark, a good friend of mine was standing out there along with a cellmate in North Vietnam, and his name was John McCain. So John came up to me and says, "You don't know me from Adam, but I know a lot about you because your friend talked to me about your condition many, many times. I'm glad to meet you." So we had many meetings with former POWs.
Wow. All right, Deb would also like to know, how did you meet your wife, Peggy?
Well, I met my wife, Peggy, in California. She went to Syracuse as a journalist and wrote books. She wrote many books, and she was a member. She and her former late husband was a member of the La Quinta Country Club, and my brother was also a member, and he knew my story, and he knew that a member of the club was a writer and asked if she would like to write my story. So she did. She wrote my story and published the book Journey into Darkness. And years after that, we were married, and she's with us here today.
Okay. There's another question. Please tell us about your book, Journey into Darkness.
Well, it's an interesting book. Many people have said, I'm reading your book and I can't put it down. So it was a good book. Peggy did a great job with that book. And it goes into great detail about some of the things I've already talked about today. So I was very pleased to get my story told.
Sure. Well, I have a question. What was the first food you looked forward to eating when you got back to the United States?
That's an easy one, steak.
Steak. A true American. All right. Oh, we have a few comments. Leah Bernstein would like to thank you for your service, and she wants to know when your story will become a movie.
Well, I can't answer that one. I guess when somebody reads a book and thinks it'll make a good movie, it will. But a lot of things happen. So that was a war, a not very popular war that I was in. So it's not of a great interest, especially about a POW. So I'm not holding my breath for a movie.
Okay. We have another comment. You are a true and very brave American, and the audience thanks you dearly for your service.
Thank you.
Also, God bless you, Colonel Smith. Thank you for your service to this country.
Thank you very much.
And another, tell Colonel Smith he looks as fit as the day he enlisted. Very handsome.
Thank you.
Okay, well, that is all the time that we have for today. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Colonel Smith, for your inspiring words on this special holiday.
Thank you.
If you'd like to send Colonel Smith a thank you, please email srgsentiments.mvs@srg-llc.com.